Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me today. So in today's video, I've got a really fun technique using stencils, layering stencils with embossing powders. Now I've got this layered stencil set from a Colourful Life Designs. I haven't had a chance to use it yet, so I'm really excited to have a little play with it today. And it's got 4 layers, as I'm going to show you against this white card panel. But these layered stencils are absolutely gorgeous. And one thing that I like about these layered stencils is that they could be used on their own. For example, you could just use the dots, you could use the 2 flower stencils together, or you could just use the leaves. And I think you could create some really fun backgrounds. I also like how the stencils are numbered, so you know exactly which stencil you're going to use next. So I've got my card panel, as I said, it's 6 by 6, and I'm going to be using 4 different embossing powders. 2 are from a Funky Fossil trio, and I'm going to be using Blackberry and Lavender. And then 2 are from the most recent trio, the Dappled Pearl Effects, inspired by Marian Anderson. And I'm going to be using Newport and Laguna from that collection. So 4 different coloured embossing powders. So let's see how we're going to be able to use those with our stencils. So first of all, I'm just going to use my anti-static powder bag. This just makes sure that there's no kind of grease marks or anything on the paper. We want to make sure that we get a really crisp emboss and we don't want powder everywhere. So I'm just going to hold everything in place using my magnets on my glass mat. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring in the Wow Embossing Pad. Now, the best way with stencils is to use some kind of blending tool. I've got a very small blending brush from Funky Fossil Designs. But of course, you could use the direct ink pad to paper technique. But with details on the stencils, you may end up missing some areas. So it is better to use a blending tool for this. So I'm just repeatedly making sure that I've got lots of ink on my brush. I want to make sure that I get a really good impression first time, and you can just about see that on the camera there. So for the first colour, I'm going to add the lavender, and this is a really lovely pale or pastel purple colour. I'm just using a piece of copy paper underneath to catch all the powder, then I can put that back in my pot, and then I'm going to heat set it on the hottest setting using my Wow heat tool. I have got a cork mat behind the paper. This does just help with warping, but as I go through this process I end up not really using it because some of the powders have got texture in them and I need to heat from underneath. So next I'm going to line up the second stencil, and because my card panel was already cut to size, it's really easy to line these stencils up with the edge of the card that I'm working on today. So that's another little trick. If you don't have any kind of special tool to help you line up your stencils, if you've already cut your card to size and you line up your first stencil with the edge of the card, it's a lot easier to then line up the next stencil. However, this stencil with its abstract design, it's a lot easier to just line up the stencil. It doesn't really matter if it's perfect, you're still going to get a great result. So again, I'm just using my blending brush and the Embossing Ink Pad, and I just made sure that I've got all of those sections covered there. So again, I'm just going to remove my magnets, remove the stencil, bring back in that piece of copy paper, and I'm going to add the Blackberry colour now of embossing powder. This is a lovely, rich, deep purple, and it does have some ultra high particles in, so that's why I'm going to need to heat from underneath. I love the way that the ultra high particles blend into the embossing powder when it's melted, and it really gives a lovely effect. You can just about see them on the camera there. It kind of creates these specks of almost black but very deep dark purple, and yeah, it's just a lovely embossing powder, this one. So heating from underneath makes sure that those bits don't blow off, and it just makes sure that you get a lovely smooth heat embossed image. You're not kind of missing any particles that have blown away. So again, we're going to add the third stencil. So this is the leaf stencil, and I'm just making sure that that's all nicely lined up. Again, I can use my magnets and come back in with my blending brush, and again, just make sure that we're adding lots of embossing ink here. Of course, if you have got a stencil tool, then you could definitely use that, and you might find that that makes it easier. However, I find that it's just as easy to use the magnets on my mat, or you could use some washi tape or some low tack tape just to hold the stencil to the cardstock. And I think you can still get really great results. You don't need lots of different tools to get a good heat embossed impression. So it's just something to bear in mind. Don't feel that you need all the gadgets in order to be able to do this technique, because you don't. So again, for this powder, I'm going to heat set from underneath. Again, it's got lots of different particles in, so I don't want them blowing off when I'm heat setting. And obviously we've got this far, we're on the 3rd layer. I don't want to wreck anything at this point. So I'm just quickly moving my heat tool from underneath. You do need to make sure that it's not too close and that you keep moving your heat tool so that you don't burn your paper. You don't want any kind of brown singe marks which can happen if you don't keep moving the heat tool around. So there's our third layer done, and I think it looks so pretty. So for the fourth layer, this is the centers of the flowers. And again, I'm going to use my magnets and use my embossing ink pad and my brush and just cover all of those centers. And this is where we're going to use the Newport embossing powder. It's kind of like a very yellowy green, and it looks beautiful in the center of these flowers. So yeah, that was the way I was going to do the centers of the flowers. And again, you can heat emboss over heat embossing. So some of these solid flowers, obviously the Newport is being heat set over the top of that, and it just kind of melts into the purple powder and it looks really good. The Newport is an opaque embossing powder as well, so that is important. If you're going to be heat embossing over heat embossing, you need to be using an opaque powder if you don't want the colour to be lost. So a translucent powder would probably get a little bit lost here. So I'm just going to trim my card panel down to 5.5 inches squared, and I'm going to add a little black matte layer as well. So I'm just doing that slightly larger than 5.5 inches squared, just so that I've got a very thin black border. Now, this ribbon came on a flower vase that I was recently gifted, and I really wanted to repurpose it. When I took it off the glass jar, I thought, oh, this ribbon is definitely going to be handy for a card project. So I'm going to use it today. I think it goes really nicely with the colours that we've got. It is elasticated, and the bow was already stitched onto the ribbon, so I haven't had to worry about tying a bow. So it's always good to look at packaging when you get it. Is there anything on it that you can upcycle? Because it's a great way of recycling something and adding it to a card. So I've just gone and die cut that smaller tag from the Funky Fossil Designs Ephemera die set, and I've got this sentiment stamp set from It's Just Paper. This is a craft stash range. It's called Sunflower Sentiments, and I'm just going to use that thank you stamp because that just fits nicely on that small tag. And I did think I was going to heat emboss my sentiment here, so I come in with my anti-static powder bag, and then I changed my mind. I thought that actually stamping it in black ink instead of using the purple embossing powder would just match the border that I've created. Now, I misstamped there, so I'm just going ahead and stamping it again. And then I'm just going to go ahead and heat set that with some clear embossing powder. I've got a really large tub of the Wow Superfine Clear embossing powder. Because clear is one of those embossing powders that I do end up using quite a lot of, having a larger jar is really good value for money. So I've just heat set that, and I'm just going to go ahead and add some white ribbon to the tag so that I can then attach it to the back of the bow. So what I'm doing here is I've just folded the ribbon in half. The looped end, I'm just feeding through that little hole, and then I'm going to pull the ribbon through the other side, and that just makes a really nice way of attaching the ribbon to the tag. I'm then going to go ahead and poke those two strands behind the bow where it's stitched to the other part of the ribbon. So I'm just taking it off the card there. I've tried to film this so that you'd be able to see it on the camera, but I know that the camera angle is not great. But I'm just feeding that behind the bow. And then once I've pulled that through, there's like a stitch on the other side. So I'm just going to grab my tweezers, and then I'm just going to kind of poke that through the stitch there. And that will just help the ribbon stay in place a little bit more. I'm going to go ahead and trim off the excess ribbon, but first of all, I'm going to tack it in place using some red line tape, and then that will just hold the ribbon in place. So I'm going to go ahead and trim off the excess ribbon as well. So I've just cut out the middle section there from behind. And again, I'm going to use the red line tape just to hold the ribbon in place. This is just a really strong double-sided tape. Of course, you could use liquid glue if you prefer, but using the red line tape just holds it in place nicely. And then when we add liquid glue all over the back of the card, that will then hold it in place nicely. So again, I'm just using some red line tape on the other side. I'm just making sure that it's nice and straight, and then we can tack that in place. So next, I'm just going to add that to the matte layer that we've created. So I'm just using some Collall Glue, which I've got in a little mini glue bottle. And I'm just going to make sure that I add glue all over the back of the card, all over the ribbon. We don't want any of this coming apart. So yeah, I use a good strong glue. It's probably better to use liquid glue here than a tape runner, for example. So once that's all in place, I'm going to then go ahead and add it to a 6x6 card blank. This is just a shop bought card blank. And again, I'm using the same strong glue, the Collall Glue, and just sticking that in place, making sure that it's nice and even around the border. I'm going to add a little bit of foam tape just on the back of that thank you tag. I want to make sure that that tag stays in place. And then that is the finished card for today. So thank you so much for joining me today. As always, all the products that I've used will be linked in the description box below. Please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you've enjoyed this tutorial, and please consider subscribing if you're not already. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.